Well, good afternoon. The mood's a little somber around the school today. It's palpable, but we have a riveting speaker who's going to lift our spirits up. No expectations, Bill. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce Bill Lauenroth, who is the newest member of our faculty here at F&ES. Bill is an internationally renowned scholar, leading scholar in grassland ecology and management. A major theme of his research is to understand drylands, particularly the role of water in regulating processes and structuring plant communities and ecosystems. He's worked primarily in North America, but he's also worked in Argentine, Patagonia, and also in Mongolia. Prior to joining Yale, Bill was a professor of botany at the University of Wyoming. He is an award-winning teacher and a dedicated mentor. He's mentored over 30 graduate students, PhD and master's students, and a number of them, I won't go on to list them, but a number of them, if you look at his students, have gone on to be incredibly impactful in the science and also in management, so he takes mentoring very seriously. He co-founded the Shortgrass Steppe Long-Term Ecological Research Program, and then he was subsequently the PI for that program for about 10 years. His research has been funded by a number of agencies and organizations, including the National Science Foundation, USGS, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And he's also an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And I just want to say I think we're really fortunate to have Bill here as a scholar and also as a mentor for our students. So please join me in welcoming Bill.
Thank you, Karen. I'm going to deny some of the allegations made. The lifting your spirits stuff, I don't think I'm going to do that today. In fact, I may sort of provide a little bit of a somber story, but I'll do my best. Okay, so I want to talk about climate change, and I'm sure that a number of you recognize the first part of my title, and you probably have an idea, you probably have a name that you would put on it in terms of the person that you think originated this idea. And I did when I first thought of it. I was sure that Yogi Berra had been the originator. But after I dug in a little bit further, turns out that probably wasn't Yogi. Probably was Niels Bohr, the physicist. But anyway, so this is about as much humor as we're going to get. So it's meant to be a little humorous, but also sort of a cautionary kind of statement. So, and I'm going to talk in general about climate change issues, and then I want to end up talking about some of the work that I've done recently on global temperate drylands. But so here's what the talk looks like. I ask, for those of you that are really familiar with these issues, I ask you to just sort of bear with me. I'm going to provide a little bit of background about climate change, what we know and how we know it, and I'll try to do that quickly. I'm going to talk about what I see as some of the key challenges in translating what we currently know about climate change into future ecological change. And then finally, I want to get to this specific example about global drylands. Okay. So what do we know and how do we know it? And one of the major ways we know things about climate change is a result of the activities of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So this began in 1990. It's a UN organization and includes thousands of scientists worldwide. And what the IPCC does is produce an assessment report at relatively frequent intervals. First one was 1990. The most recent one was 2014. And one of the things that is a little bit of a problem for us is, and it has to do with the charge of the IPCC to the scientists, and that is to produce reports that really focus on global and regional scales. Okay, so here's a figure I took from the most recent IPCC report. It's a global scale, and it is global average air temperature, the change in global average air temperature over the 21st century. So the y-axis is change in degrees C, the x-axis is years in the 21st century, and so this is some suggestions about how our air temperature might change over the century. Let me add to that this figure for mean global sea level rise. And again, the x-axis is years in the 21st century, and now the y-axis is change in global sea level in meters. So we've got, this is what IPCC produces the most of. They produce some other kinds of data, but for the most part, they're focused on global issues. There are some regional results here, but again, these are relatively large scale. I don't expect you to see much of this, but let's just look at some details for a second. And the key detail here is that this is for Europe. So the regional scale that is being presented in these reports are continents or portions of continents, and the cartoon sort of is to get us to think about what climate changes might mean for various sectors. Okay, but for us, for ecologists, for those of us that are interested in the effects of climate change on ecosystems, a lot of this information is not particularly useful. These assessment reports are full of lots of very general information. And the reason they are is that the target audience for these reports are policymakers in the member states, not research scientists trying to figure out what the effects of climate change might be on ecosystems. So the reports have almost no useful information for me in terms of trying to translate what projections are for global climate change into effects on ecosystems. But while the reports themselves are not particularly useful to me, and I suspect for many of you, the data behind the reports, and by the data I mean the model output, is of special importance to us. So, of all the kinds of things that IPCC does, I'm going to focus today on the output of these global climate models that are the basis for much of what the IPCC has to say about climate change. The model output are available. You can get them from the Lawrence Livermore Lab in the CMIP-5 archive. CMIP is a coupled model intercomparison project. This is the fifth phase of it, and all of the data are archived there. There are 20 modeling groups and 42 GCMs that contribute output data to that archive. So let's go back and look at this figure now, and let me tell you some things that I didn't tell you the first time we looked at it. This is the global surface temperature change figure. Again, change in air temperature in degrees centigrade, years over the 21st century. There were two lines on this figure, and these two lines correspond to two different emission scenarios, two different guesses about what we are likely to do to the atmosphere over the 21st century. And this blue line is for RCP 2.6. It's the sort of the rapid adaptation emission scenario. That is, we see what's happening, we change our behavior, and we reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we put into the atmosphere. The red line is the business as usual scenario. We don't do anything. We think that everything is great, and we keep on producing all of the greenhouse gases that we've been producing recently, and we continue that over the 21st century. And you can see that, according to the IPCC report, there's a huge difference in outcomes from those two scenarios. And then there are these bands around the lines. These are the 5th to 95th percentage range for the GCMs that were used to produce this mean change in air temperature. And these numbers are the number of GCMs that went into the mean. So there's lots of information here. And I said the blue line's RCP 2.6, the red line's RCP 8.5, and there are two intermediate RCPs that are not presented here. Okay, so CMIP 5 contains the output from 42 GCMs, up to 42 GCMs. They didn't all do every experiment, so the archive is not absolutely complete. But 42 GCMs for each of 4 emission scenarios. These RCP, these representative concentration pathways. So, up to 168 data sets. Data sets now are these sets of output from GCM for a variety of variables. And if you ask so why so many? There's a couple of good reasons. Number one, 42 models, because remember, we're representing 20 modeling groups. Each of them have a slightly different representation in their model of the processes that contribute to the dynamics of the atmosphere. And furthermore, all of them have legitimate reasons for including the processes in their models. So the point is, at this time, we don't have a basis for choosing the best model, or a basis for saying, this model we shouldn't pay any attention to, that model we should focus on. So these models are really representing an important part of the range, and while we might wish that we were seeing a little bit more convergence, it may be a little early for convergence. That what we're seeing now is the healthiest way to represent the dynamics of the atmosphere under our greenhouse gas forcing. Okay, so let me talk now about what I see as some of the important challenges that ecologists are faced with as we try to answer questions about what are the potential effects of climate change on this particular ecosystem. So, challenge one, and this is a really important one, and that is, there's a lot of these GCM by RCP possibilities. Let me just say a little bit about the RCPs for a moment. These are guesses about human behavior. These are these are the best guesses for how all of us will behave over the next century in terms of our emissions of greenhouse gases. So this is a very soft sort of a piece of this whole modeling business, because while these 42 GCMs, well, there's a basis for why this one has these processes represented this way and that one doesn't. There's physical reasons for that. The RCPs are a little bit tougher to defend. Okay, so the fact that there are so many of them, there's not an obvious solution to this issue. As I said, convergence is probably not a good idea at the moment, and since we know so little about how we are going to behave over the 21st century in terms of emission scenarios, it probably really makes sense to try to have as broad a coverage of we're gonna hardly emit anything to we're gonna keep emitting at the greenhouse gases at the pace that we have been recently. That's caused us to get into some of this trouble. So, what I think we need to do about this, and lots of others do as well, is try to separate these two pieces. So there's this 42 times 4 size problem, but let's separate the GCM issue from the RCP issue. And as I said, we have no basis for choosing which GCM is the best. And a recent study in climate services suggested that you need at least 13 GCMs to represent the range of behavior that we see in those 42. That any fewer than that, you're going to miss key parts of the variability in projections for over the 21st century and at the end of the 21st century. So it's really important to use several GCMs, and we can talk about whether we should average input of GCMs, but let's not do that now. Huh? Okay. Ray? I seem to be. Where is the key? Oh. I'm just trying to advance. Oh, there's the keyboard. Did I?
I'm not sure what happened.
Turn it off? I can use the keyboard too.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me finish at the. How do we get back? Is there a simple way to get back to where we were? We were up a couple slides. Yeah, we were there.
Which one? This one?
The one that's, yes, that one.
Sorry about that.
Okay, and then, so it's important to include a range of GCMs in your analysis, and choose the RCP to fit the objectives of your study. If it's not clear which one of them fits best, choose a range, and covering the breadth of RCPs may be wise. Okay, so second challenge. These darn things represent large parts of the surface of the planet. A good estimate of grid size for these models is 100 by 150 kilometers. And for lots of ecological analyses, that's huge. I mean, that's too large to really be useful. So, and climate modelers have made enormous strides over the past couple decades in bringing that size down, and it's unclear now whether they've reached the point at which the computing capability is the major limit on cell size. But regardless, these cells are large. There's a good solution. Oh, well, there is a solution for this one, and spatial downscaling is what it's called. There's two ways to do this. Dynamic spatial downscaling uses regional climate models with GCM data as boundary conditions. There aren't very many of these regional models. The other is statistical. This is probably the most common way to do this, and there are a number of statistical methods to downscale to an appropriate size. Okay, and then challenge 3, in addition to large spatial scales, these things operate at relatively large temporal scales. The data that are most common for GCMs are monthly data, and for lots of ecological analyses, it's a little too crude. You can temporal downscale in a similar way to the spatial downscaling dynamic. You can use one of these regional climate models, or you can use a statistical method. Okay, so let's summarize where we are. So there are lots of data to deal with in terms of climate change projections. They represent the surface of the planet at a relatively large spatial scale and at a relatively large temporal scale. Okay, so now I want to get into a specific example and talk to you a little bit about how I addressed these challenges in an analysis of global temperate drylands. So, let me first tell you what drylands means, and that is it's a word that we invented in the past decade to keep from having to say arid and semi-arid, or to write arid and semi-arid every time we wanted to talk about drylands. It gets really, really tiresome. So drylands has caught on. That's what I mean. That's what most people mean when they talk about drylands. And temperate, this is a reasonably well-defined climatological concept started by Lauenroth, and it just has to do with the temperature regime of a particular location. We chose to deal with the global drylands can roughly be divided into the temperate portion and then subtropical portion. The subtropical portion is huge. The ecology of those two pieces are quite different, and some of the key processes that influence ecohydrology are very different, and we decided to deal with the temperate portion. The work was funded by the Powell Center. This is a USGS Center for Synthesis. My co-PI in this work is John Bradford at USGS Southwest Biological Science Center. And we had 10 participants in the study from countries that are part of these temperate drylands. And here's where they are. Most of them are in the northern hemisphere. There's a small piece in the southern hemisphere. South America's got the only piece of the temperate zone in the southern hemisphere. We divided the Asian drylands into temperate drylands into two pieces because these two pieces have important different behaviors. So we've got a Eastern Asia and a Western and Central Asia. We included Mediterranean. There's hardly any. Spain is the only location that has any temperate drylands in Europe, and then North America, which is the other location with a sizable chunk of drylands. Okay, so here's what we did. We ran a model, and we have a daily time step, multiple layer, process-based ecosystem water balance model. And to run this model, we extracted parameter and driving variable data and ran, for each cell, ran 30 years of days. And we did that for 20,000 30 by 30 kilometer cells over this temperate dryland region. We used cell-specific soil, weather, vegetation, and climate change data, and this ended up being about 7 million 30-year simulations. We ran it on the Wyoming NCAR supercomputer, and after lots of negotiation, we only saved 21 terabytes of output data. We threw away we threw away all of the daily data. Anyway, so challenge one, how do we deal with this large number of GCM RCP combinations? What we did was select, based upon this analysis by Nudi et al. In 2013, we selected 16 GCMs from CMIP5 that represented the most independent and the best performance for this portion of the planet. We selected RCPs 4.5 and 8.5. We thought, well, we didn't think. You look at the data and we've already blown by RCP 2.6. There's no chance that we're going to be rapid adaptationers in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So the next possibility at the low end is RCP 4.5. That is a little bit higher than in terms of emission scenario, more greenhouse gases than 2.6, but still reasonable. And then RCP 8.5, which looks like where we are. If we are currently, in fact, I think our emissions are currently exceeding the projections of RCP 8.5. That is, we are putting greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at a very large rate, similar to what we've done over the past 4 or 5 decades, half a century. Okay, so this gave us 32 scenarios. We had 16 GCMs by 2 RCPs, and we ran that for all of our temperate dryland cells. Combining challenges 2 and 3, we did downscaling. We temporally downscaled and spatially downscaled all the data. We used the hybrid delta statistical method suggested by Dickerson, Lang, and Mitchell, and downscaled 32 sets of GCM output to our 30 by 20,000, 30 by 30 kilometer cells, and then we did the same with the temporal downscaling. We took monthly data and downscaled it to daily for each one of these cells. Okay. So here's what I want to do today. Of all the things that we tried to address with this analysis, I want to focus on three questions. First is, how will the area of global temperate drylands change by the end of the 21st century? This is entirely a GCM output analysis. Didn't need the soil water balance model to answer this one, because our temperate drylands are based upon, are they temperate? Are they going to remain temperate? And then are they arid or semi-arid? And some of these may move into a subhuman category, or they may move into a hyper-arid category. So there's a number of ways to lose cells from the current temperate dryland domain. How will periods of growing season drought change by the end of the 21st century? And finally, how will groundwater recharge in these temperate drylands change over the 21st century? Okay, so let's look at the area of temperate drylands. And what I want to do here is just sort of give you a little glimpse of what a bigger figure is going to cover. Here we have the temperate portion of South America. On your left is current extent of temperate drylands. And then we've got three possibilities here. Remember, we had 16 GCMs. So what we did is we threw away the extreme GCMs. We threw away number 1 and number 16 and dealt with number 2, number 15, and number 8, as we tried to cover the range and then look for the center of the response. So we've got, for RCP 4.5, we got the GCM that was found in the second rank, the one that was in the middle of this range, the 8th rank, and then the 15th rank. And so these rankings we did independently for every cell, every response variable. So the same GCM isn't necessarily in the same at the same rank for various kinds of responses. Okay, and then we dealt with three kinds of changes. We have a trailing edge of the temperate dryland distributions. Those are cells that were in the temperate dryland domain, but are projected not to be in it in the future. The stable portion of the domain, that is in there at the beginning of the century, in there at the end of the century. And then finally, the leading edge wasn't part of the temperate drylands domain at the beginning of the century, but will be by the end of the century. Okay, so here's what the whole thing looks like. And while this is truly a cool map, it's not very useful for a seminar. So let me summarize it for you here. And so now this is gathering all the data. So we have regions across the bottom here. Each one of these bars represents a region. The y-axis is the fraction of the leading or trailing edge to the current domain. And then we have 3 or 4 possibilities for change. We've got a trailing edge that was lost from the domain because of aridity, a trailing edge that was lost because it was no longer in the temperate zone, a leading edge that became part of the domain because by becoming more arid, or that it became more temperate. So the big picture here is, and here's zero. So this is zero across here. The big picture is lots of losses, not very many gains. South America probably has the largest gains. Western Mediterranean loses almost all of its temperate zone, becomes subtropical, and drops for the most part from the domain. These results are for the 8th ranked GCM, and the bars are representing the 2nd and 15th ranked GCM. So just to give you an idea of how much variability there is around that. For this Western Mediterranean losses, there's not much variability. Driving the soil water balance model with the GCM output, well, we didn't really need that for this one. The GCM output is pretty consistent in terms of projecting that these Western Mediterranean temperate sites are going to disappear. Not true for North America. There's quite a large spread in terms of losses. So we got a spread for losses and a spread for gains. So over the entire temperate dryland domain, 30% loss over the 21st century. Okay. Let's move on now to periods of growing season drought. One other thing let me just sort of circle back for a second as you look at this figure and talk a little bit about this 168 data set problem. There's 42 GCMs by 4 RCPs. In our case, we had 16 GCMs and only 2 RCPs. By trying to get a good representation of the variability that is really there with these models, and the variability that exists in our understanding of what our behavior might be over the 21st century, we end up with these potentially extremely complicated output figures. And it makes presenting the output quite cumbersome. And what we found is that trying to do too much summarizing really kills a lot of the important information that is contained in the analysis. Okay, so here's what we have. Growing season drought days on the x-axis. A drought day is a day with soil water potential less than or equal to -3 megapascals. Pretty dry. The X's represent current conditions. The y-axes are really, so we've got surface soil layers, deep soil layers, trailing, stable, and leading edges, and then all of our temperate dryland regions. So the output is, the results are quite complicated, and these are just the results for RCP 8.5. Okay, but let me just focus on stable sites for the moment, and let's look at what's happening in the surface layers. You can see that for the Asian sites, there's not much change. The current conditions fall. Well, I guess I should tell you what these bars are. So this is the range of results. Now this is results of the soil water model driven by these 16 GCMs. So this is the range of the results, bounded by the 2nd ranked GCM and the 15th ranked GCM. The bar in the middle is the 8th ranked GCM, the median, effectively, And you can see that for the Asian sites, current conditions and future conditions overlap substantially. Current conditions fall essentially right in the middle of what's expected of the future. Not true for South America. What's happening is that this growing season drought days is moving away from current conditions. There are going to be more of them in the future than there are now. Same thing for the Western Mediterranean. While we have this current conditions falling within the range, it's just barely in the range, and the median is quite a bit drier, and the same is true for North America. So for surface layers, they're going to get drier. But probably a bigger story is that the deeper layers are really going to get dry. So for South America, we're no longer a relationship between where we are at the moment and where we will be at the end of the 21st century in terms of these growing season droughts in the deeper soils. For Eastern Asia, we're still within the range. For Western and Central Asia now, sort of moving away, things are getting drier. For the Western Mediterranean, much, much drier, many more days of drought during the growing season, and the same for North America. So the big picture here is that the soil's going to get drier. This is, I'm not going to show you these results, but this is in the face of substantial increases in precipitation for many of these areas. So this is ecological drought, not meteorological drought. And this is an important concept for us to be thinking about. Okay, so let me get to groundwater recharge. So these are histograms, and what I'm showing you here are histograms for North and South America. These are really the sort of boundary results, the extreme results that we found. This is now driving the soil water balance model with the GCMs, and so for South America, well, for both, green represents the results for the driest GCM, the one in rank 2, in this case turns out to be the driest GCM. The blue represents the median GCM, and red, the wettest GCM, the one ranked at the 15th end. So here's the black line shows you where 0 is, and what you can see is that for South America, it's only the wettest GCM that's really producing many positive changes in groundwater recharge over the 21st century. For North America, lots of the GCMs are producing positive changes in groundwater recharge. Let's add RCP 8.5 to that. Add the 0 point, and you can see that things get even more extreme. That is, South America gets drier, fewer sites with positive changes in groundwater recharge, and for North America, more positive changes in recharge. In fact, all of these, essentially all of the results from the wettest GCM produce increases in groundwater recharge. And some of these are huge. And if you look at the data for North America, some of the projections for precipitation are incredibly large. They're very large. And this idea that the dry lands are going to get drier is not quite that simple. And one of the reasons is because many of the analyses that have reached that conclusion have thrown the temperate drylands in with a much larger category of subtropical drylands, and it just swamps it out, and it does look like things are going to get drier. But in many of these areas, it's just not going to be the case. Okay. So let's go back to this issue of challenges in predicting these effects. So there are uncertainties associated with GCMs and scenarios, and in order for us to be doing a responsible job communicating this information, we need to try to capture as much of that uncertainty as is reasonable. And you'll see, you just think back on the figures I showed you. What we tried to do was focus mostly on GCM uncertainty associated with the differences among GCMs, secondarily uncertainty associated with RCPs. This large spatial and temporal scale issue, we can downscale the data. There's some issues. They are reasonably well known. The thing about the downscaling problem is that it is knowable, and the issues are known, and we can work on doing a better job. I didn't mention this. Of course, I didn't mention this because, for a number of reasons. Number one, it was my model, and near perfect as it could be, which is not quite true. I didn't have 16 water balance models, and so as you look at these results, we've represented this uncertainty from GCMs, but none of the uncertainty associated with the ecological model, and there surely is some, and we need to also be addressing that issue. So here's what we discovered for these temperate drylands. Let me just recap for you. The area temperate drylands is going to change. And the largest losses will be for areas getting warmer, and that's not surprising. We have the most confidence in our results about temperature. So a lot of these areas, the subtropical zone is going to creep into the temperate zone, and I guess probably not too surprised about that. These ecological droughts are going to increase and get more important, and especially in the lower soil layers. And this has potentially important implications for the composition in terms of plant functional types. Some make better use of resources from the deep soil layers. Some do best in the surface layers. But it was certainly going to negatively influence those that rely on the deeper layers. Oh, gosh. And groundwater recharge is going to increase, except in South America. This is an eyebrow raiser, but those are, when you look at the relationship between change in precipitation, change in groundwater recharge, the R-squares are 0.5 to 0.8, and it's clear that the largest values of groundwater recharge are associated with the largest increases in precipitation, just as the largest decreases are associated with places that are going to get drier. So what I'm trying to say is it's not my problem. It's the global climate modelers' problem if they're not getting there right. Okay, so let me just say a few more things. Maybe this is the lightening of the sentiment issue here. So this issue of the difficulty in making predictions. Here's what Winston Churchill had to say about that same idea. His approach was I think pretty good. So don't make predictions. Wait till something happens, and then you can be sure. And Mark Twain also had a couple things to say, and this is one of the things he's had to say about predictions. Now, just to add a little bit of controversy, forecasting has become a hot topic in ecology. And here's a quote from a 2015 paper. And I checked pretty carefully to make sure that that none of the authors could be in the audience today. So. With that, I will quit.
The finding that deeper soil layers get drier and recharge increases seems at odds. What is your interpretation of that?
Well, that's why this concept of ecological drought is so important for us to puzzle our way through. The thing is that soil has a finite water holding capacity. And as you get wetter, once you reach that water holding capacity, you start passing water through. This is what the model does. The water no longer stays in the soil. It leaves what we would call the active soil and gets into the lower soil layers and groundwater. So we're getting many of the increases are in the cold season. So we've got lots of water sort of potentially going through the soil profile, but only so much of it is getting held, and then it turns warm, and we know that things are warming. Things are going to warm up. PET is increasing, and it doesn't. What we see are growing seasons start earlier, and they end earlier, and soils start to dry earlier, and they dry more.
So your analysis, you consider atmospheric forcing on ecosystems, but not changes of the ecosystem and their effects on the atmosphere. In some GCM runs, they actually do coupled simulation, where vegetation dynamic also changes dynamically over time. I wonder if you have compared this offline kind of calculation, projection, with the online calculation of vegetation ecosystem shift.
We have not. But my understanding of that issue is that it can be really substantial if when you're dealing with areas with lots of leaf area. And as you change that leaf area, you can have large influences. When you're dealing with areas that have large albedo and you change them a little bit, and you increase or decrease albedo a little bit, it's likely to have a much, much smaller effect. I mean, would we like to couple our model and provide feedback? Sure. But I don't see it as, we've got such a huge spatial and temporal mismatch between the GCMs and our ecosystem model that I don't see that happening soon. But I think a lot of people are doing that asking those questions and answering them in other ways.
Thank you for unraveling the GCM model and RCP for us. So I'm wondering why we don't have RCP 8.5, because as you mentioned, or a scenario even higher than RCP 8.5, because as you mentioned, our behavior now has already exceeded that scenario probably, and also given the uncertainty of the future of climate policy influenced by this presidential election. So I guess my question is, are you seeing IPCC are introducing a higher scenario in the near future? And if they do, how would you model and your results react to that? Can it be adaptive very quickly?
Well, I'm going to try to get out of this one. First of all, we're dealing with a a set of GCM output, models that have already been run under a set number of scenarios. And guessing how, and they're terrifically nonlinear. Guessing how they might respond if we increase emissions seems to me to be hazardous territory. My guess is that IPCC is working on that right now. These RCPs, representative concentration pathways, I think were defined to 2010, 2011. So they got to be defined early enough that the modelers can then put together the driving variable data to run their models. So I think it's kind of substantial machinery to be for these wheels to be turning, and I'm not in a position to guess. I mean, if we thought everything was linear, we just shove things over on the axes. Soil's going to get drier. We're going to lose more temperate drylands, and the people living in dry places in the temperate zone are going to have so much water they won't know what to do with it. Yes.
One last question.
Sure. How did you involve human impact in your water balance models? Was there, like, with adaptation in terms of like groundwater extraction and application?
No. This is entire. There was none of
Completely.
that. We just drove the model with the GCM output and didn't. We had the vegetation change dynamically, but we didn't have humans in there removing water.
Well, Bill, I think when you designed the talk for today, you didn't realize how prescient your title would be. So maybe
Is that why I couldn't sleep last night?